A book that made me chuckle into my wine, a book that made a stranger approach me after eyeing me across the dining room of the Culvers because she had enjoyed the book so much she wanted to share that moment with someone and asked me how I was enjoying it. And yet when I peeked at reviews after finishing the book, I ran into some mixed opinions, begging the question, do I have an unpopular opinion about Kaliane Bradley's The Ministry of Time? Now that this is the book in question is no surprise for you. The thumbnails are pretty obvious for these Feature Friday discussions, but hi, my name is Melody. We talk about books and book adjacent things on this channel, and most every Friday, not as most this year as it should be, but I am trying to get back into the swing of things. We dig deeper into a book, review a book, however we want to frame it. We are going to look more in depth at The Ministry of Time today, but if books, book reviews, book adjacent things sounds up your alley and you haven't hung out here before, welcome, glad to have you. Would love for you to consider hanging out more, but that is ultimately up to you. So let's dive into this book, why I loved it, why I think it ultimately does have more mixed reactions, and just where that kind of falls. And that is part of the reason I really like these discussions, because it's not that I don't find value in star ratings, but I really like being able to talk more in depth about a book with you all and to kind of explore it and let it breathe and have room to breathe. And whether a book is ultimately successful for me as a reader, we can kind of look at what I am personally responding to and whether you would have the same response and kind of what the craft of it looks like. And yeah, I'm just a big old nerd who likes to talk books, and that is what has brought us here today. But along with being a nerd who likes to talk books, I love time travel fiction. And I have not been reading a lot of time travel fiction in my adulthood. I know there are some books kind of on the periphery, but it doesn't feel like we have big time travel narratives within the zeitgeist or the kind of popular conscious within the reading world in the same way that we did when I was growing up. And granted, it may just be my perception as well, but one of my first books that I loved and returned to again and again and again was Carolyn B. Cooney's Both Sides of Time. And from there, as I moved into adolescence, my teen years, I really gravitated toward, as I was discovering romance, I was also discovering historicals, obviously, but really loving time travel romance at the time. And so to see this book, which was presented as this kind of wry contemporary time travel spy thriller with the romantic twist, this felt like it was being gifted directly to me. And in many ways, it still does. And I understand where some of the disconnect may be in terms of what draws people to time travel or what piece of time travel they're most interested in. Because we definitely do have the spy science angle of this that is kind of dangled on the blurb in some ways, and then we have the really interpersonal kind of slice of life and comedic bits of this, which exist in the same time and place in some ways, and similar kind of clashing and disconnect to the way that our protagonist and her charge are existing. So what is this book about? This book is set in Britain. Modern Britain or not, we will discuss a little bit more in depth, but a young woman who had previously been within the translation department of the ministry applies for a new job on a top secret project. And she doesn't really have the scope of this project fully when applying, but she knows that it has a pay increase attached to it. And this is how our protagonist and main point of view within this book finds herself the bridge for a time travel refugee or a time refugee, or more accurately, Commander Graham Gore, known more commonly within the experiment or the project as 47, as in 1847, who originally died on a failed Arctic expedition. Of note for anyone who perhaps enjoyed Bridgerton Season 3 Part 1, which noticeably takes place in the Regency era, not the Victorian, and so we're still failing at Arctic expeditions. And so in some ways, though I have not seen it for a very, very long time, this is almost kind of Kate and Leopold. Get Smart meets Kate and Leopold. I will return to the Get Smart of it all shortly. But the kind of conceit and the concept of this is that they are living in a home together, and our protagonist, whose name we don't really get. We know her as Bridge. We know her by the nicknames Graham calls her, but at the same time, we are seeing everything through her point of view and watching this Victorian man adjust to the modern era through her point of view. And it is very kind of sitcom-y in a lot of ways, in the way this is set up. And so there's a lot to unpack here because we do have this first person narration, and the writing is kind of staccato. It is very dialogue heavy. It is very wry. It is very dry in its comedic effect and very British in its comedy in a lot of ways, or at least how I as an American experience British comedy. Though again, I will circle back to the Get Smart of it all, but I do find some sprinkling of that kind of school of comedy as well. But we have, like I said, this kind of clashing of tone. And so on the surface, we have this comedy that is kind of exploring these social mores and the difference of these time periods. And this is what I, as a reader, am usually drawn to in time travel fiction. And I'm not saying that to kind of juxtapose and imply that I was not drawn to it in here, but it's interesting because I usually like this or kind of respond most to this within the conceit of usually a woman, because I read a lot of romance, let's be real, going back in time rather than someone coming forward in time. And there's a lot to unpack with that and time and how we experience time and what time we are living in narratively, because I like and am attracted to the clashing of the mores. And I think now the idea of reading going back in time is going to read much differently, right? I, as a teenager, was reading going back in time with a lot of rights and protections codified legally and in my mind a lot safer than maybe they ever were. And it was interesting to see that clash. And I'm just inherently drawn to like the strong modern woman kind of going back and turning everything on its head. But then here we're in the modern moment with like the adult version of the meme of what you think would kill a sickly Victorian child, except not a sickly Victorian child, a starving Victorian man. And so it's about watching him explore and discover the modern world and seeing the modern world through this new lens. And I think part of it is this idea, the book doesn't touch on this because it's never treating time tourism as an eventuality or a reason this project is being explored. And the project itself is very nebulous and hush-hush. And we'll touch on some of that in a little bit. That didn't bother me as much as it may some readers because I am not as interested, or that is not the most interesting thing in the narrative to me, is the kind of spy angle of it. Did I expect that to kind of play out maybe a little differently? Absolutely. But we're not there yet. I'm distracting myself. And so in some ways, time travel where we go back in time is a way for me as a reader to be a traveler or a tourist of the past and experience the past through a modern lens, which I find fascinating, but I'm also not going to pretend that that is not a quagmire, because there is a certain level of suspension of disbelief that has to go along with that in relation to the realities of the past, because the reality of time is that it is complicated and there is no perfect place, which I think is something that is really being grappled with in a lot of ways in the modern moment, the modern political climate, this idea of the circular nature of things, the kind of folding in of time, not to get too into like the very basics of quantum theory, because that's all I am capable of getting into, but complicating and challenging this idea that progress works in a linear nature and moves on a timeline. And when we're moving to the past, there are a lot of horrific events, there are a lot of prejudices that we have to account for. But as this book makes clear, that is just as true of the present. And watching someone grapple with modern horrors and seeing that through fresh eyes is just as interesting for me in this particular exploration. And additionally, in the narrative, Gore is not our only time refugee. We have a number of people who have been kind of plucked from tragedy throughout history into the modern moment to be saved from death and be a part of this experiment, essentially. There is no informed consent in any part of any of this. Now, I did have to take my copy of the book back to the library, though I very much foresee myself buying a copy when the paperback comes out, so I don't have as many of my notes about the particulars of the times people come from, but Gore eventually ends up additionally making friends with a couple others who have been plucked from their own time, whether saved from World War I or the plague. There are a variety of horrors throughout time, but kind of navigating through the psychological horrors of this is interesting because it's something that's kind of grappled with, the way that these people have lived through some really horrific events and are being pulled outside of all of their context and just what that looks like. And so it is acknowledged, but at the same time, as we are seeing this through our protagonist's point of view, she seems somewhat disconnected from this reality at the same time because she's so interested in Gore. And additionally, as a British Cambodian woman, she has a different perspective, and especially as a, I believe, first generation British Cambodian woman who really has had to face the realities of being a refugee and seeing or having loved ones having seen this violence and what it means to become part of this other system, and the fact that she has been paired with this man who operates and lived at basically the height of the British Empire. And while he is surprisingly progressive in a lot of ways, despite this, there is this sense throughout the book of what it means to be a part of the system and what systems you are contributing to and what those systems do. And I don't want to spoil anything too much. And I can understand if people feel like that this avenue isn't explored enough, especially because our protagonist is kind of driven by self-preservation and making herself fit within the system in a way where her sister is more interested in kind of pushing back against that system and challenging the system, down to the way where both sisters are interested in language and writing, but seeing where their careers take them differently. We have our protagonist who ended up in translation in the ministry, and we have her sister who is essentially, I believe, a freelance writer, because in this day and age, that's basically the only course, kind of revealing stories of their past and how they and how their family, how their mother were treated in Britain growing up, and kind of reconciling these different parts of her identity, while our protagonist really pushes against that and tells her that those are not her stories to tell. And so while there isn't a huge statement made, or there is a statement made, but what are we saying? And is that what we ultimately want to be left with? I can understand that being hard to kind of reconcile, especially because the spy angle of this doesn't play out as actively as I expected it to. It does come into play primarily in the later half of the book, but we really are kind of living in this intense character study and kind of comedy of circumstance in some ways leading up to that. And I can understand that being frustrating, this idea of not feeling like we're moving anywhere or what is going on. But I also think that that is the point. We are following these individual lives that are being placed in these extraordinary circumstances for which they have so little of the picture of what is actually going on within this experiment, what this experiment is actually for. And there are these really illustrative moments of character that are kind of throwaways within the narrative in some ways, but like our protagonist has to write reports on gore every day, and her main task is kind of the keeping of these records and writing reports on his assimilation. And one day she finds these reports in one of the higher up on the project's wastebasket, and yet she keeps writing these reports. And that is so clearly indicative of character to me. And also this sense of the protection of the routine and the norm. Our protagonist is seeing these glimpses that something is not quite right, but she is actively kind of choosing to ignore them in favor of the status quo and what she thinks is comfortable. At the same time, this is not a comfortable world. It's still very modern, but at the same time, it feels jumped ahead just a little bit in the sense where we have a more extreme version of climate change playing out and more extreme weather that is impacting our characters on the day-to-day in a way that is just like subtly psychologically disconcerting for me as a reader, because it's taking, especially by the time it is introduced into the narrative, because like I said, it's got this kind of sparse, dry wryness to it. And so at the beginning, we kind of feel like this is our current reality. And then it is revealed that maybe it's not quite our current reality, but it's our very close reality. And so then as a reader, we're kind of outside of time as well. And so there's all of this exploration of time without ever really dealing with the logistics of time travel. There are these mechanisms that the ministry, the government has that is making this possible with these small limitations and the fact that this is new technology. And I understand wanting to understand how that technology works a little bit more, or wanting revelations that may be bigger or better regarding the time travel and the science of it. But this is where I kind of circle back to this idea of Get Smart. Now, I have not seen the TV show. I want to be clear, I am talking about the TV show Get Smart. I have not seen it in a long time. Sidebar, if anyone knows where I can buy the DVDs of the television show, I would be eternally grateful, because I loved that show when I was growing up and watching it on TV Land, admittedly. And I think it's probably more relevant today than we care to admit. And I say specifically the TV show because while the movie captured a lot of the humor, I think it also fundamentally misunderstood a lot of the humor. That all kind of goes back, for me, in a lot of illustrative ways, to the cone of silence. Stick with me here. Okay, so in Get Smart, the cone of silence is this idea of tech where when they need to have private conversations, it comes down. We're not talking about the portable cone of silence here. And you're just in this giant plastic bubble that isn't even really soundproof, but the idea is that now you are having a private conversation. And the just kind of ridiculousness of it and the bumbling of it. And I think that that is kind of the point. And like the way that a lot of this experiment just looks kind of ridiculous on surface level from our protagonist's point of view, but then things become more insidious. Now, granted, some of my connections with Get Smart also circle back to the idea that control is referenced a lot, but I also don't really read a lot of spy narratives. And so if you were expecting the spy component or the intelligence component or the kind of twisting of this experiment component to kind of be the central focus of this book, you are probably going to be disappointed, because instead we have a character who wants this to work, who wants the system to be what she thinks the system is so badly, even while throughout the book we are exploring and acknowledging the problems of the system. And I think that some of that goes back to this idea that we want time to kind of exist in this linear thing where things improve, things get better, because that's the kind of narrative that our brains are trained for. And there's actually a quote from the book that I took a picture of that I think engages with this a little bit. It says, "I don't think I would have understood it. I didn't understand that my value system, my great inheritance, was a system rather than a far point on a neutral empirical line that represented progress. Things were easier for me than they were for my mother. Things were easier for me than for my father. My drugs were cleaner. My goods were abundant. My rights were enshrined. Was this not progress? I struggled with the same bafflement over history, which I still understood in rigid, narratively linear terms." Now, here is where some people may have a critique in terms of the linear nature of the book itself, because we do kind of challenge this linear nature somewhat from a plot perspective more than a structure perspective toward the end of the book. And I can understand the critique that maybe that doesn't go far enough. But I think kind of challenging it at all is part of the revelation and the point that we are getting to. And we are watching this character have her world kind of absolutely upset. At the start of the book, she is just looking for a higher paid job, and our stakes kind of gradually escalate. There is a sense of disquiet that starts to sprinkle throughout. There were moments where I, as a reader, started to feel like maybe I didn't really understand Gore. There were breaks in the narrative where we would kind of go back to the lead up of Gore being pulled from time. And this was in third person, but kind of seeing a new perspective of what directly led to his rescue and what his immediately before was like. What kind of frame of reference, what mentality was he being pulled directly from? And just where these breaks were coming from, because a lot of the narrative maneuverings too were revealed. At first, it was first person, and first person is a very common narrative styling now. It's not something I, as a reader, am going to question, but it became clearer over the course of the book why we were in first person, what this first person was, and in context of that as well, what the third person was. And so everything started to kind of fall together, but the falling also felt very happenstance in a lot of ways. This was a character who was forced to make choices, and forced to make big choices rather than that sought out to be part of a big choice or a big story. And then circling to the end, which I'm not going to spoil, but where we leave off on that, what that means for us. And there's a lot of ways to interpret that and to play with that. What our responsibilities as individuals are within these imperfect, very much corrupt systems. If we as individuals can go against these systems, how we operate within time and history, what that means, what our choices mean. There is some playing with that idea of the kind of different roads that converge from very simple choices and all of that quantum theory that it does not present as quantum theory. And again, I would never presume to imply that I know quantum theory, but there's a lot of big ideas, there's a lot of science, there's a lot of this kind of scaffolding in the background to support this much more intimate, individualistic story that is told with this dry, kind of wry sense of humor. And again, we have this kind of narrative that is very punchy, very staccato, and dialogue driven in a lot of portions, but then also have these moments of great reflection. And so a lot of that does come down to what exactly the narrative is as well. But I find that incredibly readable. I know that that is not going to be everyone's cup of tea, but I really, really responded to it. Now, did I think it was perfect all of the time? Absolutely not. Did I think the pacing was perfect all of the time? Absolutely not. But especially as a debut, I think it's really, really strong. And I like that it makes us think, it makes us sit with a lot of these choices that our character is making, a lot of the fallout at the end of the book that ramps up pretty quickly, and it moves things to an extreme to kind of highlight things, but also add back in some of that absurdism and some of that comedy, while also recognizing that these extremes are rooted in reality in some ways. I don't know how to fully explain it. And so I think this book is a little tricky in some ways. I think it is deceptively simple, especially in terms of its tone and style, but I think that there are a lot of deeper thematic explorations in here that are sometimes kind of pontificated on, but I think that we as readers are also empowered to unpack it for ourselves. But now that I have rambled about my potentially controversial opinion, if you have read this book, I would love to hear your thoughts and opinions. And as always, I am grateful that you were interested and stuck around to hear mine. So like and subscribe if you feel like it. Thank you again for hanging out. Read something good. And yeah, bye.